Ah, Ukraine. Every geopolitical YouTuber's favorite country to randomly mention regardless of the video's content. Every Western liberal's favorite country they know nothing about. Every Western conservative's least favorite country they know nothing about. A thorn in Russia's side. And a meeting place of historical European empire since before the Big Bang. Welcome, friends, to the third installment of Back in the USSR. And shout out to Scenic Depictions of Slavic Life for carrying this hat. If you've not checked out the first two videos on Moscow Seven Sisters and the Republic of Tuva, make sure to check those out. The point of the series is to take a nuanced look at a bygone era that gets vilified by some, glorified by others, but is ultimately just another place that people lived. Europe has a long history of borders being drawn and redrawn and drawn again and redrawn again, but Ukraine is one that got this treatment so many times over, especially during the time within the greater Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So today I'd like to take a deep dive on this. The goal here is going to take a look at when the borders changed, how they changed, why they changed, and what this meant for the people living in them. For starters, it's worth noting that, while this will be on the Soviet era of Ukraine's borders, this was nothing unique to it, and its borders changed many times even before that. Thus, this will make it a little less jarring when you realize that half of these changes all happened between 1917 and 1922. Despite some people claiming that Ukraine had never existed before Lenin created it in 1917, it just wasn't that simple. While it's true that Ukraine and many other soon-to-be Soviet republics were under the yoke of the Russian or other empires, national identity of these ethnic groups had existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years prior, just looking at a few maps. The beginning of the 20th century saw Europe in the age of rising nationalistic tendencies, and the bolstering of a world war between massive powers would only spear this on further. Thus, the Ukrainian regions of Tsarist Russia very clearly held a distinct culture, language, land, and material interests in the pre-capitalist feudal days. After the First World War, the borders would change several times, and this is where we're going to begin. So this first boundary here is what was known as the Ukrainian People's Republic, or the Ukrainian National Republic, or for short, UNR, declared in June of 1917 prior to the October Revolution as part of the so-called Russian Republic. In fact, 3 different central Ukrainian states were proclaimed following the February Revolution, headed by Mikhailo Khrushchevsky, and in January of 1918, full independence and sovereignty was declared complete with the constitution, creating what was known as the Central Rada. This didn't last too long, as a coup d'etat backed by Germans led by Pavlo Skoropadsky took complete control of this new territory, simply known as the Ukrainian state. Oh boy, that can't be good. That basically undid all the former laws and created a hetman government, which basically means a military commander government, which was an anti-socialist conservative regime. Big surprise, but the Bolsheviks were not a huge fan of this. While all this was happening, Skoropadsky disarmed a lot of the pro-Bolshevik troops, planning to secure Soviet rule, likely in response to the Soviets proclaiming their own Ukrainian government based in Kharkiv, established in the end of 1917. By Skoropadsky's time in January of 1918, Soviets were set to take Kiev under the command of Mikhail Muravyov, which happened in February. So if you're with me so far, in less than 9 months, there were 4 different factions or leaders in charge of what was then Ukraine. Following Bolshevik control, they pressed on into Ukraine's right bank, mainly against Cossacks.
We're in South Dakota. Cossacks are in Russia. Cossack!
But they would be pushed back thanks to the backing of German and Austrian forces that backed Skoropadsky after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, eventually retaking Kiev. Alarmed by this pushback, Vladimir Lenin signed a treaty in June of 1918. So now things could stay quiet, right? Not quite. In August of 1918, the Ukrainian National Union was formed to consolidate Ukrainian independence, again, headed by Volodymyr Vinnychenko, but when Skoropadsky tried to proclaim a federation with Russia, an uprising occurred just in time for the Bolsheviks to form a Provisional Workers' and Peasants' Government of Ukraine. The new directory would send diplomatic notes to the Soviets, which were ignored, forcing them to declare war on Soviet Russia in early 1919. Meanwhile, left bank Ukraine was once again captured, as was Kiev, until it was cut off and then pushed back again until August, when the UNR entered Kiev to discover another volunteer army, led by Anton Denikin's Volunteers, which created a standoff between the factions that gave the Bolsheviks the upper hand once more. And the end of that year saw underground partisan warfare. Meanwhile, out west, the Ukrainian National Rada formed in former Austro-Hungarian Empire territories headquartered in Lviv, then Lwów, including Galicia, Bukovyna, and Transcarpathia, all headed by Kost-Levetsky. So if you're struggling to keep up, there had been factions led by the Bolshevik Red Army, the Sich Riflemen, the Denikin White Volunteers, Cossacks, a group called the Ottomans, not to be confused with the Ottomans, Ukrainian Bolsheviks, and a number of other ally ships. Basically, the entire year of 1920 could be summarized by the First Winter Campaign. This was basically a Ukrainian National Republic against the Soviet 14th Army, later assisted by Poland after they signed the Treaty of Warsaw. The Red Army would then push them past the Zbruch River towards Warsaw until the Poles concluded a separate peace treaty with the Bolsheviks in October of 1920. By then, the Ukrainian National Republic Army was pushed into Polish-controlled Galicia. Finally, in the end of 1921, there was a second winter campaign where one last attempt was made to spark an uprising against the Bolshevik government, which was to no avail, bringing us to the borders of Ukraine we saw in 1921. Throughout this entire period, we basically had two different Ukrainian territories, one that looked like this in the west, and then the larger one that looked like this. By 1922, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic borders looked like this, and the capital city would be Kharkiv. So what did all this mean for the people in the region? Well, like many things, it kinda depends on who you ask. For one, the Treaty of Riga the year prior not only gave Soviet Ukraine these national borders, but Poland also recognized what would become Soviet Belarus, a whole other topic. However, much of the population in this region would see continuous battlegrounds of violence over all the former factions. Many of the peasants simply wanted land, which the Bolsheviks would manage, for better or, worse. And the party also inherited the tensions that lasted after this for pretty much the rest of the century. For now, Kharkiv would be the capital of Soviet Ukraine, and this was a very industrious city with universities, and would somewhat act as a prototype to what is arguably Stalin's most important work, Marxism and the National Question. Basically, the new territory needed to fall into the new Soviet policy, while also retaining Ukrainian customs and culture, birthing the experiment known as Korenizatsiya, or indigenization, which was implemented union-wide. The problem here is there wasn't a very defined set of rules as to what defined Ukrainian or not. But because of this conflicting area, Ukraine saw a massive boom in art, particularly in this new capital of Kharkiv, with Habsburg artists as well as Polish and German influences giving it a unique flair that stood apart from the other Russian arts. An example from my sources is the play Hello from Radio 477, performed in 1929. Lastly, this area seems to have birthed what would create massive contradictions. On one hand, it created a hotbed for dissenters, namely those who didn't particularly care for this new Soviet rule. Two such examples were the poet Vasil Stus, who had spent a little time in the Soviet Gulag system, as well as the artist Alla Horska, who would meet end later on from the KGB. On the other hand, it wound up being a center for nomenklatura, as both Soviet premiers Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev came from here. But let's move forward. Actual state borders didn't change again until 1939, save for a tiny change in sovereignty in this area in 1925, but we should point out the changing of the capital from Kharkiv to Kiev in 1934. Part of the reason it was moved to this in the first place was because of Kiev's large levels of Ukrainian nationalism, but Stalin's first two five-year plans saw the need to establish machinist, electrical, and chemical industries. That caused a boom in population by the end of the decade, reaching a population of over 800,000 despite other areas getting hit with a famine you may have heard of before. Thus, the next big border change came in the form of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, seeing what is now considered West Ukraine added to its territory from eastern Poland. Not only did this cause Poland to cease existence as a state again, but it would set the stage for the upcoming Second World War as Germany would push and occupy all of it. From here until the end of the Second World War, Ukraine was one of the largest theaters of war, which brought not only complete destruction and bloodshed of its citizens, but the Holocaust itself changed Soviet Ukraine to an extreme degree. About a third of the Ukrainian population was Jewish prior to this war, and even the small rural towns were not overlooked in this. As for Ukrainian nationalists, invasion first seemed like another opportunity for independence, until it was clear that Germany was not going to grant such a favor. The Polish city of Lwów would become Lviv after the war ended, cementing the western borders we see today into Ukraine. World War II also saw a few other changes that tend to get overlooked. For one, there was the question of Bessarabia and Bukovina. This was already being fought over by Ukraine and Romania prior to the full establishment of the Soviet Union. The short version is Romania kept it under strict control with low economic and cultural development for over 2 decades, and a famine in 1935 stirred even more discontent. Thus in 1940, the USSR annexed the territory under the threat of war to Romania, which gave the counties of Akherman, Izmail, and Khotin to Ukraine, and the rest would become the Moldovan SSR. Unfortunately, the Second World War wrought destruction here too. When German and Romanian troops occupied it just a year later, a police regime established forced Romanianization, concentration camps were set up, and I think we all know what came next. Nonetheless, reoccupation in 1944 saw the former Soviet order restored, where Transnistria was handed to the new Moldovan SSR, which also has a landing impact we still see today. And the Paris Peace Treaties in 1947 would recognize these Soviet claims to Bessarabia. Looking even further west, Transcarpathia became part of the newly formed Czechoslovakia in 1919, but 1945 saw it as the next Ukrainian border change, as it became the westernmost point of the Ukrainian USSR. The region didn't truly see autonomy under Czechoslovakia until 1938, however it did see some of the smoothest development of any modern Ukrainian territory within its time frame. You know, since it would have dodged that whole war communism thing and the Holodomor. Why this happened is because Transcarpathia was mainly made up of Russophiles, Ukrainophiles, and the indigenous Ruthenian, all of which had conflicting views on the national character of the region. Since the Ukrainophiles were amongst the younger population, they picked up the most traction. The Munich Agreement, giving Germany control over West Czechoslovakia, gave Transcarpathia its autonomy, renamed Carpatho-Ukraine despite its occupation under Hungary all the way through World War II. After the war, a Czech-Soviet agreement would give Transcarpathia to Ukraine, but despite the nation's border growth, it saw some of the worst losses in the entire war. Ukraine as a whole lost nearly 5 million of its own population. Hundreds of cities and thousands of villages lay in ruins. 10 million people were left homeless. Only 20% of its industry remained, and even less agriculture and transportation still stood, netting about 40% of the entire national wealth in material losses. Because of this, the population in the post-war period needed rapid reconstruction and heavy industry, which meant tight authoritarian control and a lack of consumer goods. Industry was recovered by the turn of the decade, but agriculture took all the way until the 60s to recover. Sovietization was a very rough and oftentimes violent process in the aftermath of the war, particularly to those carrying out Ukrainian nationalistic activities, which again, weren't very well defined. In fact, Ukrainian Greek Catholics were even merged with the Russian Orthodox Church, effectively ending the former's existence officially for now. The final piece of the post-war border changes was Snake Island in the Black Sea, given from Romania, mostly just because of its maritime boundary significance, which takes us to one last border change before Soviet dissolution. This guy, Crimea. Only a year after Stalin's death, Crimea was essentially handed to the Ukrainian SSR from the Russian SSR, acting as a bit of a gift from Nikita Khrushchev to commemorate the 300th anniversary of Russian and Ukrainian merging. Oh, there's no way that this would cause any problems 60 or 70 years down the line. No chance of any wars breaking out over this. No annexations to try to take it back into Russia. Not a single bad thing could ever come from this one. Right? Right? Well, actually, throughout the rest of Ukraine's existence within the USSR, and even a little after dissolution, that basically was the case. Most of the indigenous Tatar population resided here due to deportations during the war, which helped boost some identity on the peninsula. Further, Ukrainian officials saw better opportunities for promotion, and the nation during this last border change saw relatively stable times, with growth in ethnic Ukrainian representation and gradual decentralized economic management. Naturally, this also meant a growth in consumer goods being allowed without the presence of a devastating war and a newly industrialized economy, which the population generally benefited from. On the flip side, however, much of this would plant the seeds for the upcoming stagnation and corruption, with de-Stalinization creating massive divides within the population. And if I keep going any further than this, I'm going to end up moving beyond the point of the video, which was just the border changes and its effect on the population. Yeah, a lot still happened between 1954 and 1991. But as far as the border changes go, this would see the end of it for a couple decades. I did look to see if there were perhaps any small overlooked changes, and I couldn't find any, but if I did miss one, please let me know in the comments. What are your thoughts on this subject? Did I cover these fully and objectively enough? I know this is a very complicated subject, and I also know there were a lot of controversial topics presented very surface level. I'm open to any and all feedback, and I actually broke down my sources by topic in the description. Until next time, comrades.